Let's bring in Olivier Knox. He's chief Washington correspondent for Yahoo News, and he joins us now from our Washington bureau. Good to see you.
Hi, how are you?
All right, so before we get to tonight's rally in Arizona, let's begin with the president's speech last night. You wrote that Mr. Trump was trying to, quote, rally the country behind an open-ended commitment. Talk about the challenges associated with that.
Well, the president announced essentially a reversal from a lot of his past remarks in which he very strongly endorsed a complete withdrawal from Afghanistan. He talked about rebuilding America first, not pouring money into that nearly 16-year-old conflict. And what he did last night was very publicly announce that he had changed his mind and was now committing to an open-ended commitment to keeping American troops there for the foreseeable future. There are a lot of things that he didn't tell us, and that was very notable in the speech. He talked about an escalation in American troop numbers, didn't give us a number. We understand from senior administration officials that it's going to be about 4,000 or up to 4,000. He talked about pressuring Pakistan to, quote, immediately end its support for extremist groups, but didn't really spell out how or what would happen if Pakistan didn't do that. He talked about India stepping up economic development in Afghanistan. Didn't really say what would happen if India did not do that, and didn't really address Pakistan's concerns there about a larger Indian role in Afghanistan. He didn't talk about the price tag for his plan. He didn't, really most notable for me, he didn't really ask Americans to expect any sacrifices here. He paid tribute to the men and women in the armed forces, but made no real attempt to sort of say, look, this is going to get worse before it gets better. There was no moment in which he invited America's civilian population, which has largely forgotten this war, to support it and to prepare for sacrifice.
And that may be what the president was banking on there, Oliver, because as you point out, many people have not thought about this war in Afghanistan because it's been going on for so many years. There was a statistic out recently that in a few years, some of the soldiers, sailors, Marines fighting in Afghanistan will not have been born during 9/11, which is astounding when you think about that. And so the president said his initial instinct was to pull out of Afghanistan entirely, but
right.
That meetings with these cabinet members in general shifted his perspective. Is that significant?
It's very significant. For one thing, what he talked a couple times about not writing Afghanistan a blank check, basically putting the onus for nation building on the government of Afghanistan. When he talks about changing his mind like this, and it took a lot of months of frequently angry debate inside the administration to get to this point. You know, it raises questions about, well, actually, what would trigger him to reevaluate this policy? It's fairly important. You know, he recently lost his top strategist, Steve Bannon, who was the most vocal and forceful voice for a change in course. This is a very stay the course, despite the president's rhetoric. This is a very stay the course policy. The big changes that he highlighted in his speech aren't that big. There are changes to the rules of engagement. In other words, how Americans fighting in the field can fight. There are going to be changes to the way Americans are deployed. We expect to see more Americans closer to the front lines. The rhetoric on Pakistan was important, but without knowing what he's willing to do about it, it's a little hard to gauge. So this was he ultimately backed what is fundamentally an establishment strategy that may or may not alienate members of his base who thought that they were getting out of foreign entanglements by electing Donald Trump.
Olivia, it's interesting. I want to jump off something you just said, which is we were talking about the fact that there are a lot of people in this country who may have forgotten about America's commitment in Afghanistan, but there are some who have not. And you referenced Mr. Bannon and the people that, or the supporters of Breitbart, those supporters that Mr. Bannon brought to the table for the president of the United States to help him win that election. Mr. Bannon has advocated against the president's strategy, as he stated last night, because he thinks it's the view of the globalists, as they call them. This new strategy, or this strategy that is old, which some people are saying it is, will not sit well with those folks, right?
If you looked at the front page of Breitbart.com in the minutes after the president's speech last night, you saw a very unhappy response. You saw, gosh, you know, we thought we were going to change the course here, and we're actually staying the course. There was a lot of very angry rhetoric. What I don't know yet is how that translates to Donald Trump's base. You know, there was a very brief blink and you miss it moment during the 2016 campaign where he was cornered on his past comments about withdrawing and said, actually, it looks like we may have to stay a while. That was notable. But he wasn't asked about it. Well, neither he nor Hillary Clinton were asked about Afghanistan in the 3 presidential debates. You alluded to something earlier that's really kind of heartbreaking. You know, you see the American casualties being identified, and these are people who were basically barely toddlers, barely out of diapers when this war began on October 7th of 2001.
Yeah, and Olivier, one of the things that has been sort of talked about in the hours after the president delivered that speech yesterday is how different this is from past administrations, the Obama administration strategy, President Bush's strategy. And there are others who've said, look, this is really business as usual. And not only is it business as usual, we don't really have any specifics that Congress or the American people can point to, any kind of barometers to measure success or failure in the region. I just interviewed Admiral Winnefeld, who was who's a vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He said, really, look, at the end of the day, this idea that President Trump is now listening to his generals and President Obama did not listen to his general is really not accurate. All presidents listen to their military commanders on the ground. Ultimately, how they sell it to the American people is perhaps different in who they are. But this isn't new, as a lot of people are saying, and we don't have any way to measure.
Right, and that's why we're going to have to watch the congressional hearings on this strategy. I assume, now they may have enough money to implement the strategy through the end of the fiscal year, so to October 1st, but after that they're probably going to need some more money, and at that point that brings senior officials up to the Hill for congressional hearings that are going to examine this new strategy. And I think it's going to be really important. That's going to be the time when we get a better sense of what the benchmarks for success really are, beyond the sort of talking point bluster of we're going to kill terrorists. Well, you know what? Killing terrorists is a policy that's been in place since September 12th of 2001. That's not especially new. Talking about the conditions on the ground, determining things, that's not really new. President Obama did set a notional withdrawal timetable when he announced his troop surge in late 2009. But if you go back and look at his speeches, he talked about following the conditions on the ground. Watch what happens in Congress. That's where the action is going to be in the next couple of months in terms of fleshing out this policy.
All right, finally, Olivier, let me get your take on the president's trip to Arizona tonight for a campaign-style rally. Yesterday, he spoke eloquently to the American people. He was on a teleprompter. When he is on a teleprompter, when a speech has been written for him, the president does very, very well. The question will be, and I think a lot of people will be watching, is I'm just guessing he'll have a teleprompter in Arizona as well, but it's when he veers off that prompter that generally the president gets into, has controversy generated from his speeches. What are you expecting? I mean, he tried to walk back what he had said last week with regards to Charlottesville that drew a lot of criticism from both sides of the aisle. But a lot of people feel it's a little too late, and it's not what's in his heart, although one can never know what really is in somebody's heart.
Well, the really interesting thing to watch here is whether we see more evidence for what is obviously a growing rift between the president and Republican leaders on Capitol Hill. You know, he's been increasingly referring to Republicans as them and they. They have to pass repeal and replace. They have to do this. He's at war, as Carter pointed out. He's in a rhetorical war with John McCain and Jeff Flake, the state's 2 Republican senators. What's going to be interesting to see here is, does he double down on his de facto endorsement of Kelly Ward, the person challenging Jeff Flake? Does this rift deepen? Does it put him more at odds? There's a super PAC tied to Republican Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell that's out with an ad today, really hitting Kelly Ward hard. Does this rift deepen? And what are the ramifications for an extremely busy legislative schedule in September and October?
All right, Olivier Knox of Yahoo News. Always great to have you. Thank you, sir.
Thanks.